Okay, let's unpack. Our mission today is a very specific and I think very contentious deep dive. We're looking at something that really, it touches nearly every family with a streaming option, and that's children content.
Specifically Netflix.
Specifically Netflix. We are wading into a report that sparked, a massive debate online, focusing on some very specific quantitative claims about what's in the programming for young audiences.
Indeed. We're dissecting a discussion that really zeroed in on a year-end content audit. It was conducted by the activist group Concerned Women for America, or CWA.
And for context, who are they?
Well, CWA is a conservative activist organization. They're pretty well known for focusing on social issues, monitoring media content, and their analysis of Netflix's kids programming for this particular year was, let's say, highly critical.
What's fascinating, too, is that the whole conversation around this is itself layered with controversy.
Oh, definitely.
Our sources detail that the talk around the CWA report, it happened to coincide with some major industry buzz.
Right. This is when everyone was talking about X, formerly Twitter, possibly becoming a streaming service.
Exactly. And that timing led some to suggest that the sudden, huge online virality of this report wasn't entirely organic.
That's right. The term that was used in the source material was astroturf.
Can you break that down for our listeners?
Sure. So for you, the listener, astroturfing is basically creating the illusion of a widespread, spontaneous, grassroots public move, like a digital firestorm.
When it's not.
When in reality, the effort is actually centrally organized, maybe even funded, to push a very specific message or agenda.
So whether that initial digital firestorm was completely manufactured or not, the claims themselves, the numbers in the CWA report, they demand some serious scrutiny just because they're so striking.
And so relevant to parents.
So our goal for you, the learner, is surgical. We are going to extract those specific quantitative claims. We're going to try to understand the very specific categorization methods CWA used to get to them.
Which is key.
And then we're going to analyze the very strong arguments that were presented in the source discussion about the perceived intent and the real-world impact of this content.
It is absolutely essential here that we separate the quantitative claims, the hard numbers, from the ideological commentary.
And the extremely aggressive language that was used to interpret.
But we have to acknowledge that in the discussion we analyzed, those two things are completely intertwined.
Yeah.
The report is trying to quantify something that was for a long time considered pretty abstract.
Which is what? The saturation of certain themes in kids' media.
Exactly. The saturation of specific, very charged themes.
And to set the stage for why this all matters, here's the initial shock factor, the number that just immediately hooked.
Go on.
The CWA report alleges that a massive 41% of Netflix shows targeted at children across all the categories they looked at for 2025 contained LGBTQ content.
41%.
That's approaching nearly half of everything available. That single statistic, it just sets the stage for this entire very intense discussion. Now that we have that 41% overall claim just, ringing in our ears, let's dive into section 1 and break down this specific.
Yeah, because the CWA analysis wasn't monolithic. They didn't just throw out one big number and, leave it at that.
No, crucially, they assessed the content across different standardized age and rating categories. That alone suggests a pretty methodical approach.
And that granularity isn't just academic. It's functionally crucial for parents.
How so?
Because parents rely so heavily on these standardized rating systems, TVY, TVY7, TVG, to be the gatekeepers for what their kids see.
It's like a contract, right?
It's absolutely a contract.
Okay.
If the rating doesn't align with what's actually on the screen, the entire protective system it failed.
Yeah.
And that leads to a crisis of trust.
Exactly. And the report's findings suggest that this contract is, at least in their view, fundamentally. Let's start with the claim about the most basic general audience category. Our source material focused specifically on the G-rated category, sometimes labeled TV.
General audience.
The claim is that a full 41% of shows designated as G-rated on Netflix reportedly included latent LGBTQ content, including transgender.
Just think about what G-rated is supposed to mean. Historically, it's the most benign, universally acceptable content, suitable for all ages.
No risk of anything offensive or challenging.
Right. So to have 41% of that category flagged for, as the source claims, blatant content, including transgenderism, well, that means the most basic filter for family viewing is, they argue, compromise.
That's why the number is so staggering.
It really is.
And that 41% G-rated figure, it needs to be seen in contrast to the categories that are designed for the youngest viewers. Kids still in those critical developmental stages.
For sure.
For the TVY category, which is generally for kids up to age 7, the CWA found that 21% of these shows contained LGBTQ plus content.
21%. Even that, in the TVY category, is a pretty significant number. We have to consider what TVY even means.
Suitable for all children.
Right. It implies themes that are non-challenging, focused on simple, positive social skills. A kid at 5 or 6 is still just navigating basic emotional regulation.
So to have 1 in 5 programs introducing these complex identity themes is, for the critics, a very deliberate choice.
A choice to preempt parental involvement at the absolute earliest stage.
And then we move up to the slightly older demographic, the TVY7 category.
Ages 7 and up.
Right. These are shows that are designated as appropriate for children who might be a little more mature, able to handle maybe some minimal fantasy violence.
Sometimes with supervision.
Exactly. So the CWA analysis, as detailed in our sources, it combined the data across all these child-related categories, TVG, TVY, and TVY7, to get an overall average.
And when they averaged it all out, the total was
33%.
33%.
Yeah.
This specific breakdown immediately raises some analytical questions, which the source material does address.
Like what?
Well, why is the TVG category general audience allegedly seeing the highest saturation at 41%, while the TVY category for the very young is at 21%?
What's the theory?
The theory that's posited by the source is that the content placement is often targeting family viewing.
Under the guise of just general harmless entertainment.
Exactly. It's not being confined only to content for older kids, TVY7, which is where you might expect some minor introduction of real-world complexity.
So if you, the learner, are a parent trying to navigate this, these granular numbers are suddenly intensely relevant. You might think, okay, I'll stick to TVY for my 5-year-old. I'm safe.
But even there, according to this report, 1 in 5 shows has this content.
And if you broaden that filter to allow G-rated programming, you are, according to CWA, approaching a 50-50 chance of encountering this theme.
It underscores precisely why the CWA focused on these categorical numbers. They wanted to demonstrate that the presence of these themes isn't isolated to some niche older teen program.
They're saying it's pervasive.
Pervasive and distributed across all age groups for kids and family. Their conclusion, and the really strong rhetoric of the sources we analyze, is that this challenges the whole integrity of the rating system itself as a functional barrier for parents.
So the perceived breach of this rating contract is what gives the whole discussion its justification for using such strong...
Absolutely. It's that feeling of having the goalpost moved on you. The rating system is supposed to be the user manual, and if the contents page is misleading, especially on topics parents want to introduce,
it just triggers this huge crisis of trust in the platform.
Which brings us to Section 2. The CWA report, it didn't just stop at counting the presence of theme. They also tried to implement a qualitative measure. Meaning they attempted to assess the severity or the extremity of the content they found within those shows.
Okay, so this moves the discussion from just quantity to the quality.
Precise. And this is where the CWA's own internal definitions become critically important because they're not necessarily standard industry terms.
They made up their own scale.
They created their own internal spectrum for rating the content. Our source material details this system spanned 4 categories, from meta to implied to queer-coded, and then finally to explicit.
Let's quickly define those, at least as they're being used here.
Okay, so meta might suggest content where the themes are discussed about the characters rather than shown. Implied is more of a subtle hint, a suggestion of orientation.
A fleeting comment, maybe.
Right. And queer-coded is generally used to describe characters where the orientation is suggested through metaphor or subtext, aesthetic markers. It was really common in older media before explicit representation was mainstream.
It allowed for interpretation without outright declaration.
Exactly. But the category that draws the most significant controversy, and the one that critics use to justify their most extreme claim, is that 4th. And this leads us to the most extreme claim made in the source material, focused on that TVY7 category. Remember, that's ages 7 and up. The report allegedly found that a stunning 24% of TVY7 rated programs contained explicit gay sexual content.
24%. 1 in 4. So according to this analysis, nearly a quarter of shows for kids 7 and up crossed into what CWA defined as explicitness.
Which is why it's so vital to understand CWA's specific definition here. It may not align with how the industry officially uses that word.
So what do they consider explicit?
The source material clarifies that for them, explicit content in this context included outright declarations of homosexuality and transgenderism and sexual behavior.
Okay, so that's their claim. It goes way beyond just having a gay side character. They're alleging overt discussions and depictions of orientation, identity, even sexual activity aimed at 7 or 8-year-olds. When the source material presents this, the hosts in the discussion, they try to put this modern claim into some kind of context with a historical baseline.
We do. They recall a very specific, relatable cultural moment. An anecdote about learning about a gay character while watching, what was it? The Nanny?
The Friend Drescher show, yeah. At around age 7.
Right. So the host recounted watching the show seeing a gay character, and naturally turning to their parents and asking, "What's that?"
It's a moment of passive incidental exposure. The content existed, but the child had to initiate the conversation.
And the parental response, according to the anecdote, was just minimal and definitive.
It was something like, some men like men, some women like women, and that is of absolutely no concern to you until you're older.
Yes. And the source material argues that this simple, neutral boundary setting is really all it needs to be if a kid asks a question.
So the juxtaposition is pretty powerful, rhetoric.
Very. You have this historical moment of incidental exposure leading to a quick, neutral parental boundary that redirects the child to age-appropriate concerns.
Versus the current claim of pervasive, intentional saturation, where nearly a quarter of TV Y7 shows are allegedly forcing the issue into the child's conscience.
Essentially preempting the parent.
Right. So the core anxiety here, it's about the shift in that dynamic. Historically, representation was passive. It required a child to act.
Now, the critics are arguing it's intentional saturation, which preempts the parent and establishes these complex themes as normative at very, very young ages.
So for the source, the issue isn't whether diverse people.
No, it's how and how often that existence is presented to minors, and often framed in a way that critics claim is prescriptive.
Which means the parent stops being the initial source of information and is forced into the role of correction?
Correction or providing a strong counter-narrative. You're basically fighting against a quarter of the shows your child might watch. The battle shifts from raising an informed kid to protecting one from systemic external mess.
And this analysis of saturation, it brings us squarely to Section 3, the debate over intent.
Wait.
When the critics look at these sticks, the 41%, the 20%, the central question becomes, why? Why is this happening?
And the source material argues emphatically, with extremely strong language, that the answer is not the benign goal of simple representation.
How do they make that case?
They rely heavily on what they call a gross statistical disparity. The hosts in the source discussion, they really emphasize the statistic that this content allegedly represents 44% of children's programming.
When you take the high end of the CWA's findings.
Yes, and they compare that to population data, suggesting the LGBTQ community represents roughly 2 to 3% of the overall population.
So that disparity, 44% of content versus 2% of the population, that's the engine driving their entire argument.
It is. They claim that if it were truly about proportional representation, you'd expect to see, 2% or 3% of the content.
And when it jumps so dramatically to the 40 plus.
The critics argue it ceases to be representation by definition and becomes something else.
And that something else is described in very confrontational language in the source material.
It's explicitly stated that this is not this lie that we're sold of representation.
Instead, it's described using terms like
indoctrination, brainwashing, and a nefarious agenda.
The source discussion argues that the calculated aim of this massive content push is to lead kids toward gender confusion and sub-medicalization.
And to communicate the perceived severity of this, the comparison they draw is incredibly aggressive. They describe the process as getting children indoctrinated into a cult,
implying a highly organized, high-pressure, coordinated recruitment effort targeting kids through entertainment.
And it's essential to understand why the source material views this as a nefarious agenda instead of just, say, artistic freedom. For the critics, it's nefarious because it allegedly promotes a path, the medicalization path, that they claim is falsely advertised as reversible.
So they're saying the messaging from the industry suggests that puberty blockers and hormones are temporary.
Yes, and that they're reversible. But the source material refutes this, claiming there are profound and lifelong consequences that are minimized in the public discussion.
Things like fertility, bone density,
surgical intervention. The argument is that if a child is put on this path of gender confusion and then medicalized, there's no getting out of this. So the perceived goal is to lead children down a permanent path they're not equipped to consent to.
Furthermore, the source material links this alleged agenda directly to perceived, measurable consequences in the real world.
They do. They point to an alleged increase in the number of minors reporting gender confusion as the direct, observable result of this content saturation over the last decade.
The host did express, I guess, a tentative note of hope, though.
A small one.
They mentioned reports suggesting that the explosive growth in these numbers might be plateauing or even starting to decline.
Indicating that some people are beginning to realize that certain aspects of trans ideology are, in their word, proving to be like basically a fad.
But the overriding concern remains pretty severe, focused on the permanence of medical decisions made under social pressure.
And this concern extends beyond just streaming. It goes into public institutions, highlighting a broader perceived cultural.
Right. They mentioned the content in school libraries that is so inappropriate, that people won't show it at news conferences.
Yet it's deemed acceptable for children to access in a school environment. This speaks to the perception that the agenda is systemic, reaching far beyond just the Netflix homepage.
And this perceived saturation, this agenda, it leads to some extreme personal stakes being articulated by the host. One contrasted their hypothetical views from a decade ago with their stance now,
which is a powerful way to frame this shift in the cultural climate.
10 years ago, the host suggested they would have been totally accepting if a hypothetical son wanted to wear a dress. Express yourself, great.
That's a classical liberal acceptance of personal freedom. It was about the individual child's organic desire.
But their view today, in the context of this alleged organized agenda, is radically different. Their current stance is over my dead body.
And the shift in reasoning is the crucial part for understanding their perspective.
The thought is no longer viewed as organic expression. It's seen as an agenda being pushed, as brainwashing transmitted through media.
And so the goal shifts drastically from parental acceptance to parental protection.
Making sure this cult, as they call it, would not be allowed to get their hooks.
This sudden and radical transition in parental perspective is a really powerful rhetorical tool in the source discussion. It illustrates this feeling of being under ideological siege.
So the fight, for the critics, isn't about rejecting an individual.
No, it's about aggressively rejecting what they perceive as an external, manipulative, and powerful institutional force trying to hijack their child's identity and future. The stakes are framed as nothing less than existential.
Okay, so moving on to Section 4, the source material, it doesn't just focus on the content and the data. It shifts focus to the mechanism that allegedly produces control.
Right. They analyze Hollywood's proven historical power to shift public opinion. It establishes a critical precedent that the industry is perfectly capable of executing these large-scale social engineering campaigns.
And the historical examples they cite, they're not just illustrative, they're foundational to their whole argument.
They're trying to show that Hollywood has a demonstrable, documented track record of successfully altering public perception on major social issues over time.
So what are the big examples?
One primary example cited is the issue of abortion. The source claims public opinion on abortion rights changed drastically and rapidly in America, largely due to Hollywood's specific, often sympathetic, portrayals of the issue.
Right. So whether you agree with that change or not, the mechanism of media influence, proven.
And a second, maybe more universally accepted example is the shift regarding smoking. Rates of smoking dropped significantly in America, and the source links this directly to a cultural shift in Hollywood, where they began to demonize smoking and showed protagonists doing it less and less.
And they note the reason for that reduction is key, too.
Which is?
That showing drug use or excessive smoking could negatively affect a show's official rating, which could cost studios advertising dollars or time.
So it establishes a clear precedent. The industry responds to oversight and rating pressures when there's a financial or regulatory incentive. The mechanism for content control works.
Okay, so if we accept their premise that Hollywood can successfully shift public, they then dive into the alleged mechanism controlling the narrative specifically for LGBT content.
And that is the GLAAD mechanism.
They refer to GLAAD of defamation and make a stunning, very strong claim about their institutionalized power.
The claim is that GLI has a representative or at least institutional influence in the writer's room of every TV show that features a gay character or a significant gay storyline.
That's a huge claim.
It's mad. And this relationship is presented not as benign cooperation, but as industry oversight and gatekeeping that enforces a rigid ideological conformity.
Do they have any examples to back this up?
They cite a specific high profile. The emotional Will Byers speech in Stranger Things was allegedly written in conjunction with GLAAD.
Wow. If that's true, the implication is enormous. It means an external advocacy group is vetting the emotional content of even the most popular mainstream entertainment.
And the source argues that this approval process is why gay content often feels like the same old shit.
Meaning it follows predictable, safe, didactic narrative beats.
Exactly. They claim GLAAD is effectively approving everything that makes it to air, ensuring it adheres to a very specific, rigid ideological script that prioritizes the message over creative complexity.
And this narrative control, they argue, has had a profoundly negative impact on the quality of creative writing, especially post-20.
The source material draws a really sharp contrast between what they call the effective method used before 2020 and the current allegedly constrained approach.
So what was the old effective method?
It was taking characters that everybody already liked and trusted and just showing them being normal and accepting of their...
A subtle relational approach. It shifted perception organically over time without feeling like a lecture.
It felt real. The change post-2016, however, is characterized by the writing becoming ham-fisted.
Clumsy, crude, obviously contrived.
And this is blamed on the writers and producers being so tied to the message, either personally or because they fear backlash, that they lose the necessary artistic distance from the material.
So the result feels like a mandatory lecture and becomes inaccessible to a broad audience.
To use a great analogy for this, it's like AI stories written by people who are terrified of AI.
The fear or the agenda overrides the ability to craft clever, engaging fiction. The message becomes higher.
And it destroys the artistic merit. The belief, therefore, is that the current gatekeeping system effectively disincentivizes people from writing good gay characters.
Because they're constantly afraid that someone, a GLAAD representative, another watchdog, is looking over their shoulder, ready to judge whether the character meets their specific, rigid standards.
Exactly. Why bother investing in complex, nuanced creative license when that license is so heavily constrained and monitored?
That whole concept of creative constraint and the rigidity of the approved narrative, it leads us directly into Section 5.
Where the source material provides some powerful anecdotes illustrating this complete lack of nuance and the outright suppression of narratives that don't fit the message.
And the most compelling evidence of this alleged rigidity, it comes from a host's own professional experience with creative sense.
A moment where the invisible hand of industry gatekeeping became explicitly visible.
Yeah, they recounted writing a series that had advanced far into the development and pitching stage before being forcefully shut down by an...
And this series was designed around a very specific critical premise. It focused on a former punk rocker who was gay and was trying to date among what the host called, and we should be clear, this is the source's term, the alphabet people.
So the core premise was deeply satirical.
The punk rocker persona was supposed to be a symbol of rejecting the conformity and, their word, bullshit, inherent in the established queer dating culture they were observing. He was a critique of the culture, not the people.
So the host was trying to explore a gay character who was a nonconformist, a character resistant to being put in a rigid...
But the reaction from the industry group was allegedly swift and absolute. The show was immediately deemed homophobic.
And the host was personally labeled self-hating for trying to critique the culture they belonged to.
Which demonstrates a profound and immediate rejection of any non-conforming, nuanced, or critical narratives about the culture itself. It proves the strict limitations on creative expression.
It reinforces their central argument perfect. If you try to write a gay character who criticizes the gay or operates outside the approved framework, you get shut down and labeled an internal traitor.
It proves the content is dictated by what the gatekeepers deem acceptable, and this pressure for a singular approved message has, according to the Force, just severely impacted storytelling quality.
Leading to the loss of nuance and the subversion of expectations qualities Hollywood used to thrive on.
To illustrate, the host brought up a classic example, The Bird.
One host calls it the greatest movie. But why? What made it brilliant? According to this analysis.
What made it brilliant was its masterful subversion of expectation. The drag queen husband, Nathan Lane's character, he ends up sharing the same fundamental, stable, conservative family values as the rigid Republican congressman father.
Prioritizing marriage, fidelity, family, stability.
It was a shocking, hilarious, and deeply nuanced subversion. It humanized the characters on both sides by finding common ground in the most unexpected place.
And the source argues that modern gatekeepers would never allow that.
The narrative today would be forced to be purely antagonistic. It would have to demonize the conservative politician without any complexity, without any surprising shared values.
Hollywood used to love that subversion, but now the pressure to deliver a specific, predictable message just makes storytelling intellectually shallow.
The depth is lost.
And predictability is one thing, but the source also addresses a darker side of freedom. The claim that modern content exploits this freedom like early HBO did, but for more, exploitative.
Right. They specifically mentioned the popularity of what they term heated rivalry porn.
What is that?
It's content, described by the source, that looks watchable, like a legitimate drama, but it functions essentially as stylized, low-bar pornography.
Exploiting the lack of censorship for ratings.
Exactly. They cite things like WNBA heated rivalry spinoffs being pitched as Instagram skits, just illustrating the explicit sexualization being packaged as entertainment for clicks.
The desire to escape these constraints, the rigidity, the predictability, the push toward exploitation, it's palpable.
The source material highlights an attempt to break free via independent production. Specifically, a new project one host is working on, a romantic slasher film with 2 gay characters.
And the artistic choice at the heart of this project is crucial. The conscious, deliberate decision was made that the word gay is never mentioned.
It's intentionally about universal theme, love, commitment, danger, death, rather than identity politics.
And the villain, critically, is not a metaphor for external homophobia, which predictable, accepted wrote.
Instead, The villain serves as a metaphor for the internal flaws of the community itself.
Specifically, the culture of superficial hookup, contrasting with the protagonist's quest for genuine love.
And the producer explicitly stated, the villain is a metaphor for what they turn, and we have to quote this directly, it's an intentional provocation, the fucking gay culture, specifically targeting that hookup dynamic.
So the entire project is an overt rejection of the conforming mandated culture that rejected the host's previous concept.
The use of a slasher metaphor to criticize the internal culture is so non-conforming that the host anticipates it will inevitably cause a shit fit from the very gatekeepers who rejected the first idea.
It's an act of determined artistic defiance.
It is.
And before we wrap this up, we have to integrate that technical tangent that came in from a listener comment.
Yes, the color grading, color palette slop.
It seems unrelated, but the hosts tie it into a broader industry malaise and loss of craftsmanship, a symptom of the same intellectual laziness caused by ideological strain.
The listener comment attributed this slop, this visual flatness in modern streaming content to copycat directors and producers, with a case of, you can make it look like Joryism.
So the ease of modern digital production is eroding technical quality.
That's the argument. Back when directors were shooting on physical film, they were literally forced to light scenes properly on set.
Because film was expensive and hard to correct.
Right. But now, with the ease of raw file color grading, directors can just light things in a generic, flat way and fix it all later, relying on digital manipulation instead of craft.
And the result, according to the sources, is that movies and shows are now flat, dominated by depressing blue and gray and gross palettes.
And just poorly lit in a way that feels totally generic. They cite shows like Reacher and Paradise on Hulu as examples of this aesthetic flatness.
The argument is pretty compelling. Millions are being spent on productions that look visually due to laziness or copycat practice.
It suggests the malaise isn't just ideological, but also artistic and structural across the whole industry, a systemic loss of craft.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? We started with the very specific quantitative claims of the CW.
Right. 41% of G-rated show, 21% of TVY, and that shocking 24% of TVY 7 shows allegedly containing explicit gay sexual content.
A definition that included declarations of homosexuality and sexual behavior.
And this extensive data set, regardless of its methodology, is used by critics to argue that the issue isn't proportional representation.
Given that massive deviation from the 2-3% population statistic.
Instead, they argue it's a highly coordinated, powerful agenda described in the source material as indoctrination and brainwashing aimed at promoting medicalization.
And we've seen the alleged mechanism of control, the institutional presence of groups like GLAAD in writer rooms.
Which critics argue restricts creativity to only the approved narrative, leading to writing that is ham-fisted, predictable, and lacking the nuance of successes like The Birdie.
And through those extreme personal anecdotes of censorship, where a critical gay writer was labeled homophobic, and the example slasher film,
we see how some creatives are trying to fight back against this rigid ideological control by seeking independent paths, even if it means writing stories that are overtly critical of the culture they're supposedly meant to celebrate.
So if the claims of the source material are accurate, that powerful industry groups dictate a rigid, approved narrative for minority character, effectively shutting down nuanced or critical storytelling, does true authenticity or creative depth become impossible in mainstream media, regardless?
Is the artistic constraint imposed by ideological purity functionally the same as the artistic constraint imposed by a budget or a rating system?
That raises the final provocative thought for you, the informed consumer. If mainstream content feels dictated, constrained, and predictable, be it ideologically, like the GLAAD critique, or artistically, like the color grading, what responsibility do you have in seeking out and financially supporting those independent voices and creators who are actively trying to tell complex, non-conforming, and challenging stories outside of that constrained system?
Does the solution to rigid conformity lie in the decentralization of consumption? That's the challenge that remains long after the streaming service